I'm excited to see so many of you here today. We have a really great presentation lined up from our awesome experts. I have with me our expert panelist, NCARB Vice President of Examination, Jared Zurn, and Assistant Vice President of Examination, Michelle Cohn. And for myself, my name is Claire Hilton. I'm a member of NCARB's Marketing and Communications team, and I'm happy to be your moderator for today's NCARB Live. So last week, we announced that we're going to be migrating to PSI on June 14th. And so today's webinar, as you probably know, since you have registered and are here, is an opportunity for you to learn what you can expect during or before, during, and after the migration. So our panelists are going to start by going through the top big questions about the migration that we've already been hearing from candidates, namely, why is NCARB migrating to PSI? Or what about exam seats that I've purchased but haven't used yet? All of these things we are going to cover. And after this, we want to hear from you. So after this, we will go into a live Q&A, and throughout the webinar, you can type your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. This should be somewhere towards the bottom of your screen. So just keep that in mind throughout the webinar, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion. But before we dive in, let's get to know our panelists. Jared, how about you introduce yourself first, and then let's hear from Michelle.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jared Zurn. As Claire said, I'm the Vice President of Examination. A little bit more about myself. I am an architect, and I actually joined NCARB staff about 13 years ago, and I've worked on the examination the entire time and oversee all aspects of operations and development. So we're really here today to answer your questions. So I see thumbs already scrolling into the Q&A, and that's great. So we're just going to try to get to as many as we possibly can. Thanks for being here.
All right, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Cohn, and as Claire said, I'm Assistant Vice President of Examination here at NCARB. I have been with NCARB for about 8 years now, and I'm also an architect, same as Jared. So I've spent my time at NCARB also working on the examination, both on the development and on the operation side of it. So I'm glad to be here and look forward to answering your questions.
Awesome. Thank you both for the lovely introductions. And in case you missed it earlier, before we go into the presentations, I do just want to remind everyone again throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please do use the Q&A feature towards the bottom of your screen. And like Jared said, we will try to get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion in a bit. Now, Jared and Michelle, I know our attendees are eager to hear from you both. So without further ado, I will pass things over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Claire. As Claire had mentioned, there's just a couple of questions we want to answer right out of the gate, because these are questions we've already been receiving through our customer relations service line, as well as when we're doing outreach. And the first one I'm going to start with is sort of the high level of question of why is NCARB making this change? Like, why did we decide as an organization to move test delivery from Prometric, which we have been with for a very, very long time, to a company called PSI? And what I will tell you is this was not a hastily made decision. NCARB went through a full RFI, RFQ, and then RFP process to really understand the landscape of who can provide test delivery services for you as a candidate and who's going to serve you best. And so we looked at where our test center is located. We looked at the overall delivery technical capabilities of the various test center vendors. We looked at their online platforms as well as their on-site platforms. And it was sort of this across the board decision that really led us to making the choice to go with PSI. And we are hoping that what you're going to see are some improvements in the way you schedule, the way you pay, your experience at the test center, that is going to make this a better experience for you, the candidate.
I'll just add on to that. Besides those just experience changes that Jared described, There's also some changes that you'll see right away that you might have already noticed in the draft guidelines that we released last week with the announcement, as Claire was describing. One of those is reduced costs for rescheduling. The parameters for that are outlined in the guidelines. You'll be able to reschedule 48 hours before your test center exam and up to 24 hours before your online proctored exam at no cost. You'll also see the opportunity to even cancel your exam pretty close up until your appointment time for a small fee. So those are both changes that we're rolling out now, again, with the migration to PSI. You're also going to see more detailed feedback on your score reports, and you'll see a new practice exam dashboard that actually takes the existing demonstration exam that I'm sure many of you have used already and brings it into a dashboard where you can actually track your progress on practice exams as you are studying for your ARE.
So the other thing I want to point out right away before we get started is the changes that are being made to delivery. We're not changing the exam itself. So the content of ARE 5.0 is remaining exactly the same: the division structure, the division length, the amount of testing time, the tools that are built into the test driver and the test center. All of that remains exactly the same. And if you've had a chance to look at the draft guidelines, you're going to notice nothing about those changed, right? We integrated and showed you all of the information that used to be in the handbook in the new guidelines, and number of questions, length of time. Like I said, all of that remains exactly the same. So continue to use the practice and the demonstration exam, as Michelle had mentioned, because that's the best way to prepare to be ready for in the test center experience.
And another thing that's staying the same is that opportunity to choose either that test center exam appointment or an online proctored appointment. So just as we have currently with Prometric, PSI will deliver in both modalities. Again, in the online proctor delivery, what's staying the same, there will still be that clean desk policy. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later on in this session. Your PSI test centers, this is something that's come up previously. You might see a different PSI test center location than what you're currently used to with Prometric. Overall, PSI has a larger and a more distributed network of test centers than Prometric. So we're excited for a lot of our candidates. Hopefully many of you will not have to travel quite as far to a PSI test center. Some of you may need to travel farther. There's inevitably going to be some change there. But as we mentioned, one of the reasons that we're excited to move to PSI is because, as I said, they have a larger network of test centers and a more distributed network, meaning their test centers are not as concentrated in urban areas, but tend to be more scattered, which we think is going to be a great advantage for a lot of our candidates.
So we do have some candidates that test on the ARE that receive testing accommodations. And we also want to point out that testing accommodations are still going to be available with PSI. So you don't have to reapply if you've already applied for accommodations. Those are going to continue to roll forward as you migrate your eligibilities from the Prometric environment to the PSI environment. What you will notice if you're a candidate that has testing accommodations, there will be a slightly different scheduling flow that you will go through. So we've worked out a process with PSI to hopefully better serve you as a candidate to find a local test center that meets your needs and can support your testing accommodation. We'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, throughout the next couple of months before we get to launch.
We've received some questions from candidates who are looking forward to the migration, but all the same, they already have exam seats that they've purchased and are sitting in their records waiting for their next exam appointment to be scheduled. What's going to happen to those exam seats? Well, if you've pre-purchased exam seats, no worries. Those exam seats will stay with you through this migration to PSI, and those will continue to be available to you. You'll use them the exact same way that you currently use them with Prometric. They'll count the same way when you start scheduling exams with PSI. So if you have exam seats and you aren't quite ready to use them yet, don't stress about that one. You will still be able to keep those seats in the migration to PSI.
And I think our last sort of top question we want to cover before we jump directly into the ones you're asking is we are getting questions from candidates that have scheduled appointments with Prometric between now and May 31st. And they are asking if they're going to be able to reschedule those appointments out of Prometric and into the PSI channel. And the answer is no. As we have been communicating at NCARB for quite some time now about this migration, These are two distinct systems. And so we are literally disconnecting from the Prometric system, and it is in no way connected to the PSI environment. So there's really no way to transfer an appointment or reschedule an appointment. And the reality is, yes, with Prometric, candidates are not able to cancel an exam appointment. And so the reality is, as we've been advising, please do not schedule any appointments with Prometric unless you plan to take those appointments with Prometric, because once you schedule, you have locked in an appointment time with Prometric and the use of that seat credit.
Awesome. Thank you both, Jared and Michelle. I personally already feel more informed. So hopefully our attendees do as well. I think that we're going to go ahead, like Jared said, and jump into some of the questions that you are all actually asking right now. So I'm looking through the Q&A, and the first thing that I want to ask from one of our attendees, and I'll ask it to Jared, what are the changes to the draft guidelines, the draft ARE guidelines, aside from the PSI changes? Are there any additional updates that we need to be aware of?
So really the biggest change to the guidelines is, over the past couple of years, we've been hearing from candidates that they sometimes have a hard time connecting the information that's in the handbook, which is a separate PDF document right now, compared to the guidelines with Prometric. And so the biggest change is we've honestly merged all of this information into one document to give you kind of a one-stop shop for you. So yes, it is a large PDF, but it's broken down and bookmarked in a way that makes it user-friendly. There really are, like I said, no significant changes. There's no changes to the exam itself. So that information did not change. Number of items. We did try to rewrite some of our policies in just clearer language to help you understand it. We also took some of our key information that's on our blog and we moved it into the guidelines as well. Just again, trying to explain policies and procedures as much as possible to be as transparent as possible, so that way you don't have to go searching for information. You truly can know the guidelines as your one-stop resource.
Awesome, thank you. I think, let's see, our next question we have here, it's about candidates' concern as far as being able to schedule an exam between that May 31st, middle of June period. Can you speak to what that will look like for candidates? Michelle?
Sure. So as we've said, the Prometric Scheduler is open from now through May 31st. So if you intend to take a Prometric exam, as Jared was mentioning, if you know for sure that you want to test, either because you like testing with Prometric or you're on a roll with your exams and you just want to keep going, right? You can schedule your appointment through May 31st, no problem. Those appointments will be honored. They're not going anywhere. Between starting June 1 through, we'll say midnight on June 13th, there will be no testing. And we need that time for a couple reasons. One, as Jared alluded to earlier, if candidates have any challenges in the Prometric test centers, those last couple of days of May, something happened, maybe there's a power outage, we want to be able to make sure that we can take care of candidates and be able to work with them to still get them back into the Prometric test center, maybe those first couple of days of June, just to be sure that those candidates can still test as planned, under their Prometric appointment. So that's one thing that might happen. We hope not. We hope that there aren't any challenges, but we have that cushion just in case. The other thing, the bigger thing that's going to be happening during those 13 days is finishing up that systems migration. So as Jared mentioned, the Prometric system and the PSI system really are two distinct systems. And so we need this period of no delivery to ensure that all of the data is appropriately migrated without any kind of oops moments happening. And so it's really critical for us that we have that downtime. We'll be hard at work on the kind of on the admin side, making sure that all of those systems are connected to the right places as we migrate from one vendor to another. The important thing, and I think this was in the ARE update that was sent last week, late April, early May, candidates will be able to start migrating and scheduling appointments with PSI. So from that late April, early May timeframe through May 31st, you can go ahead and start getting into the system, get your appointments on the books starting June 14th. So that blackout period won't impact your testing progress because you'll already have those appointments set up starting June 14th and beyond.
So, and I'll follow up on that question because I saw something scroll through one of the Q&A already, and they were talking about a rolling clock extension. As Michelle had mentioned, the system is going to allow you to be scheduling appointments way ahead of time. You don't wait, right? You're not totally down on this. So your testing progress will continue. So I want to reinforce that. If you are a candidate that just so happens to be running up on your rolling clock, and it could potentially expire right around this end of delivery with Prometric and the early delivery with PSI, then what I'm going to ask you to do is please reach out to our customer service team. They can work with you to give you sort of a short rolling clock extension that will accommodate for this like bridging that's going to take place between the two systems. But the reality is for other candidates, let's say your rolling clock is still 1.5 years, 2 years away, the way the systems are going to be rolled out, it's not going to impact your ability to plan and schedule. So it's not going to impact your rolling clock.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for those detailed responses. So another question that I am looking at, I know that you both already touched on accommodations, but we're still getting several questions and concerns about accommodations transferring to PSI, as well as will those accommodations be different? Are there additional accommodations? And so I was wondering, Jared, if you might speak to that.
So the goal that we have is that if you are a current candidate that has an accommodation, that accommodation is not going to change, right? So if you have extra testing time, you're going to continue to get extra testing time with PSI. If you get a separate testing room, when you test with Prometric, you'll get a separate testing room if you test with PSI. Are we looking at rolling out new accommodations? Why, yes, we may actually be looking at some other opportunities for candidates to receive some additional testing accommodations. You're going to hear more about those as they become available. So I don't want to put out any promises on this webinar that I know I cannot deliver to you as a candidate, but I will tell you that we absolutely are working on the back end with PSI to roll out some additional accommodations, again, that we hope will help you as a candidate.
Thanks so much.
Sorry, I was just going to add on to Jared.
Go ahead.
And again, because he had kind of mentioned that, so I just want to expand on it for a moment, is the accommodations. PSI is equally committed to providing accommodations as Prometric is and as NCARB is. So that the idea of getting accommodations, how you'll apply for accommodations, all of that stays the same. The process of scheduling your appointment is going to just shift a little bit because the scheduling system is changing in the move from Prometric to PSI. So the way that candidates were accustomed to contacting Prometric to schedule an appointment with accommodations, that process is going to change a little bit. And it's our scheduler will walk you through exactly the steps that you need to take. And if you are applying for new accommodations, our customer service representatives will walk you through as well what you can expect to happen as you're scheduling your accommodated appointments. Candidates should also know that some accommodations will not work in the online proctored setting that are applicable to a test center setting. So that's, again, something that we have with Prometric. There are a few changes with PSI just related to some specific requirements in PSI test centers. And again, that is something that our customer relations experts can work with you on a one-to-one basis, answering any detailed questions there. So know that there are some minor changes, but by and large, accommodations still is an important aspect of the ARE that will continue with PSI.
Thank you both for that response. Another question that I'm seeing in the chat is about PSI in-person test centers. I know it's exciting that we have a larger and better distributed list of PSI test centers. But do we know if there will be centers that are added to this list? Yeah, that is the general questions that I'm seeing throughout the Q&A. Jared, would you like to take this one?
Certainly. So as Claire has alluded to, on our website right now, we have put out a list of test centers that PSI will immediately open and be able for delivery with the ARE starting on June 14th. Will that list grow over time? We certainly do hope so. That's one of the benefits we saw in selecting PSI, is that PSI works with a slightly broader range of third-party test center providers, as well as educational institutions. And so it allows, hopefully, the ARE to have even a broader reach than what you see on that list. We did open some educational test centers with Prometric over the last couple of years. We continue to plan on opening more, hopefully, test centers in that environment with PSI.
Thank you, Jared. Now, Michelle, another question. Can you explain how the score reports are changing?
Sure. The score reports are going to be changing when we start delivering with PSI, and that is for candidates who fail their division. So if you've passed your division, you're not going to see any change in the score reports. You'll still see the information that you passed, and that updates your rolling clock information. For candidates who failed their division, again, page 1 is going to look very similar to what you're used to with Prometric, but with the addition of something that's called a scaled score. And this is intended to give candidates a bit better of an understanding of how well they did, I should say how far or close they were to that passing cut score. A scaled score is something that you might have encountered on other standardized exams, like the SAT is one that a lot of people took back in their high school days, or certainly others that use scaled scoring. And so this is an opportunity for us. You won't find out the exact cut score and exactly how many questions you answered correctly or how many you needed to have answered, but that scaled score provides you that extra layer of feedback to understand how close, relatively speaking, were you to that passing threshold in your performance on the exam. Then page 2 of the failing score report will have, again, some enhanced feedback for you in that descriptive feedback section that gives you a bit more information about your performance at each section within that particular division, as well as some comparison information to how other candidates who passed that division, how they performed on each section. So again, that gives you some understanding of where your performance is and likely where you might need to get to on your future attempts at that division. And again, I'll reference back to the new guidelines document that was released in our email last week and is up on our website. There's some great information about the new score report layout in that document. So I encourage everyone to really take a look at that, see the example of it, and learn more.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Now, Jared, a question that I know a lot of folks have been asking, is the exam interface changing?
So as I had mentioned earlier, the specific exam delivery software that we use, which is a software called Exam Studio. So that's the blue bar at the top all the way down to the next or previous buttons at the bottom. That interface is not changing in any way. Now, when you do sit down to take an exam with PSI, will the screen look slightly different? Yes, it will, simply because PSI has its own little bar, right? So they have some buttons that PSI makes available to you if you go into a test center. And so those will be on your screen, but the overall exam functionality is not changing. For any candidate who's taken an online exam or done a test run with Prometric, you'll also notice a change when we switch over to PSI's online application, which they refer to as Bridge. Again, it's because they have some tools built in at the top of the window that you'll be able to use. I mean, there's some actually pretty handy zoom in, zoom out functionality that's built into the overall test driver with Bridge. So you'll start to see those differences.
Awesome, thank you. Let's see. thank you all for all of your great questions throughout the Q&A. And thank you, Jared and Michelle, for just running through them. Okay, so a question about scheduling. When can candidates begin scheduling with PSI? And Michelle, I'll hand that one over to you.
Great, thanks, Claire. So again, late April, early May is when candidates will have access to the feature that allows them to migrate their records from Prometric to PSI. And when we say migrate, that literally means your eligibility to test, which is currently set up in the Prometric system, that eligibility will be moved to the PSI system. And so that is why that migration is a one-way only change for you, because we're actually revoking that data from the Prometric system and establishing it in the PSI system. Once you're set up in PSI system, then you'll have the opportunity to start scheduling exams. You'll see a new look and feel to your exam tab, to how that scheduler works. The scheduler is really now brought into the NCARB system. So instead of being pushed into the Prometric system to schedule, you'll stay entirely within the NCARB system as you schedule your exam with PSI. So late April, early May, we're putting the finishing touches on all of those processes right now. NCARB will definitely let candidates know when that tool is available for them to use.
Awesome, thank you. Another question, back to in-person PSI test centers. How can candidates find the different PSI locations that are available to them? Jared?
So the best way, so first of all, please do not use Google. Do not go to Google and just type in my local PSI test center. Because as I had mentioned earlier, PSI works with a variety of third-party test delivery vendors as well. So if you search for PSI, you're really limiting your search to only their proprietarily owned test center locations. So you're not going to get an accurate result. So the best place that you can find out right now where your closest test center will be for June is from the NCARB website. So we released a blog about the ARE update and our guidelines to, going to PSI. And on there is a link to a PDF document, because that's the best way we're going to put it out right now, is just a giant PDF of all the test centers in which PSI will be delivering the ARE come June 14th. What will also happen though is once you open up the scheduler, once you migrate and you see that new scheduler functionality, you're going to be able to just search for local test centers or your closest test center right inside of that application. So we figured I don't expect you to look at a PDF document the rest of your life. That is a temporary solution so you can see where they're at. Once you migrate, it's all built into the system.
And Jared, I also wanted to add that list is also available, not just inside our blog, but on the website. If you click on at the top past the ARE, there's a section right in there that says taking the ARE with PSI. And so it's right there on the website, also in the blog post if you're looking at our blog. So there's a few different ways to navigate to this PDF.
Thank you both. That is super helpful. Let's see what our next question is. So our next question is on exam fees. Michelle, tell us, are exam fees changing?
At this time, we are working to maintain the current exam fees, but fees in general is always something that we look at NCARB, and also our board of directors is reviewing. And so if there are going to be any changes to fees, we'll certainly let candidates know with appropriate notice in advance of any changes happening.
And I guess I will say there are some fees changing, but they're changing in the right direction for you as a candidate. So the overall fee, the exam seat fee is what Michelle was referring to. But if you've had a chance to look at the updated guidelines, rescheduling fees are decreasing. My video has frozen, so I'm back, I think. So I'll say it again, rescheduling fees are decreasing. There's a lot more flexibility and no costs involved in rescheduling exam appointments with PSI, which is a savings for you as a candidate. The other thing that we're rolling out is a new feature that is going to actually allow you to cancel an exam when you do have something scheduled with PSI. There's a fee involved with that, but it's definitely better than forfeiting the full $235 that you do today if you're a no-show.
Okay, thank you both. Let's see, now another question, and I will ask this one to you, Jared. Will scratch paper be coming back?
Scratch paper is not ever planned to come back to the ARE. And I know candidates want it, they keep asking for it. As NCARB made that decision, well over a year ago, and Michelle alluded to, we truly want a clean desk policy, whether you're testing in a test center or whether you're testing online. And so scratch paper is removed, the tools are built into the test driver, all candidates then use that same set of tools.
And on that note, I'll really encourage everyone to try out that demonstration exam. That's the demonstration exam. You can link to it just on our website. Also, when you are logged into your My NCARB record, there's a link to it as well. So a lot of ways to access that demonstration exam. When you're taking that demonstration exam, you'll see all of the tools with all of the same functionality that you can expect to see both in the test center and in your online proctored division. And so that is the perfect chance to practice using all of those tools, whether it's the references tab, the whiteboard, the calculator, everything is there for you to practice and get comfortable with before your actual testing day. I've heard from candidates who are taking demo exams provided by third-party test prep providers and yet open up the NCARB demo exam so that they can use the whiteboard, the real whiteboard, while they're doing their other practice questions. And so I think that's a great strategy to just get used to the whiteboard if you haven't used it previously, and be sure to try out all the various features of that and really use the right tool inside the whiteboard for whatever it is that you're trying to do, whether it's a drawing or taking notes or what have you.
Thank you. Yeah, the demo exam is so important to make sure that you are comfortable and don't feel like you have any surprises on test day. So thank you for noting that. Another question, Jared, I will read you this one from the Q&A. One attendee said, if I scheduled an exam, can I reschedule it to PSI?
So if the exam is scheduled with Prometric, then no, you're not able to reschedule that into the PSI network. As we've noted, again, completely separate systems, appointments made with Prometric are Prometric appointments. And so your truly only options with Prometric are to either reschedule before the May 31st timeline, or potentially you could just be a no-show, but then you forfeit your test fee. So it's going to be better for you to obviously go in and attempt that exam than simply not show up.
Thank you. Another question from the Q&A, and Michelle, I will turn this one over to you. One attendee asked, are we still going to get immediate feedback with regards to pass or fail after a PSI test?
Yep, absolutely. And it sounds like this attendee is referring to the provisional feedback that candidates have the option to see while they are in the test center or in their online proctored exam. After you have answered all your questions, you're back on that exam summary screen, you hit end exam, there's some reminders for you, and then this opportunity to see your provisional feedback. How is the preliminary assessment of how you did on your exam, just the one that you just finished? And so, yes, that will still be available to all candidates, no matter the modality, once we move to PSI. That's part of the exam tools and functionality that we were talking about earlier that we said isn't changing. So the provisional feedback will stay the same. And then candidates, once they then finish up their exam, you can expect to then see your score report in your record within a couple business days. There might be a slight delay, kind of that first week of live delivery starting June 14th. But once all of our systems, are all connecting and firing on all cylinders, then once again, candidates will be able to see those score reports in their records pretty quickly, within 1 to 2 days after taking their exam.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. Let's see. Thank you all again for all of these great questions. Okay, so I know we've talked a lot about PSI, but we still do have a little bit of time left with Prometric, which is something our next question is about. One attendee asked, when is the last day that candidates can purchase Prometric exam seats? And when is the last day we can test through Prometric facilities? Jared, could you speak to this question?
Sure. So I'll answer the second part first, which is the last day you can test with Prometric is May 31st. You can schedule an appointment with Prometric basically a couple of days into the future if there's availability. So in theory, it is likely possible that somebody could log into their NCARB record if they have not migrated to PSI sometime in mid to late May and still capture one remaining test appointment on May 31st. If your goal, however, is to test with Prometric, and you do want to do that, I would suggest you make that appointment now. Please do not wait until late in May and then hopefully get that last appointment slot.
Thank you so much. Another question, and Michelle, I will send this one to you. When can we expect a final ARE 5.0 guidelines document by?
So that is a great question. If you looked at the one that we released last week, you'll notice there's a big draft watermark stamped on it because it is a draft document. So I would expect the final document will be released by June 14th, which again is that date that we will be live testing with PSI. I don't want to make any candidates nervous then about, well, how draft are these draft guidelines? If they're trying to plan, maybe they're able to schedule that first appointment with PSI on June 14th, and they're wondering, but wait, am I not being able to see the correct guidelines before I test? I want to assure everyone, the draft guidelines that you're looking at are very close to the final guidelines. In many cases, the word draft is there just so we can give it that one last internal review as we're looking at just the last few details on the coordination of our systems. But I would say you can most definitely use the guidelines that have been released to start planning your testing with PSI. And even if you want to be one of those first candidates to test with PSI, you'll be in good shape working with the draft guidelines that we released last week.
Thank you, Michelle, for that response. Now, our next question is really referring to someone who was just starting out on their testing journey. One attendee wrote, I am just starting the ARE. Would you recommend waiting until after June 14th to take the exam through PSI or to take my first exam before May 31st with Prometric? My thought is maybe this answer could go a couple of ways, but Jared, I will let you share your thoughts.
Sure. So I will take the it depends approach. Honestly, this is a choice that as a candidate, you're going to need to make based on your comfort level of testing right now. If you feel that you are ready to test on a certain division, you've prepared for it, and you're ready, waiting until June basically causes that knowledge to just sit there for the next couple of months. And if that's the case, then I would actually suggest that if you feel you're ready, go test with Prometric. If you literally have just received your exam eligibilities and you're starting to prepare and you're not 100% confident in going into test right now, then I would say then don't go in and test right now because you're not 100% confident. Then what you should do is then I would suggest you wait. This really is a it depends answer because it's all about you as an individual. If you're ready, go test. If you feel you're not ready, then don't test.
Thank you, Jared. Now, our next question is about tech. So, Michelle, one candidate is wondering if we could give an update on the tech issues that candidates were experiencing when the exam first moved to online proctoring. I know we had a few candidates experience kind of some minor issues. And yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to those. Have we ironed those out?
Sure. That is a great question. Happy to address it here. And I think what that question there is referring to is when we first launched online proctoring with Prometric, which was, if we can all think back to December of 2020, which feels like forever ago. But that is when we first launched our online proctor testing with Prometric. And yeah, those first few months, there were a lot of technical issues. And some of it was Prometric and NCARB learning some more things about how the systems were communicating. Some of it was candidates learning more things about what setup they needed to have in place in order to have a successful online proctored experience. So we spent a lot of time working with Prometric really to address both sides of that, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't adding any impediments to candidates' opportunities to test. And over time, we were able to really make some great system improvements to the online proctor delivery with Prometric, to the point where now technical issues with online proctor delivery are about the same as technical issues in Prometric test centers, which is to say that there are at I don't know, maybe a few percentage points of any group of candidates, on a particular day, or, we track it weekly, in fact, the technical issues. The last several months, we have not seen any areas of concern. We've been really pleased to see the data coming back. We track that data, and Prometric tracks that data and then shares their data with us. So we have two different ways of understanding technical issues in both test centers and online proctor delivery. And as I said, the rate of technical issues is just about the same in both of those modalities, which is really what we want to see. It's at a very manageable level. That being said, if you are one of those rare candidates that does experience a technical issue in either the test center or online proctor delivery, I completely understand. That feels awful, it feels really disruptive, and it feels unfair. So I completely get that. So I will just encourage everyone, if you do experience a technical issue, make sure that you say something to your test center administrator at the test center. Make sure you notify the proctor and the online proctor delivery. Make sure that that Prometric staff documents that issue appropriately, and then contact NCARB yourself after you've left the test center or logged out of your online exam. Make sure you contact NCARB as well, and that way we can research the issue and determine the appropriate resolution for you.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question, I know we've touched on this a bit, but we are still seeing several questions about seat credits. So Jared, are Prometric seat credits transferable to PSI?
Well, so let's kind of clarify my response. So if you have an exam seat purchased right now inside of your NCARB record, and you have not used it to schedule an appointment, that exam seat credit is going to remain in your file. Like, it's just going to sit there. And when you migrate over to PSI, it's still going to be sitting there. So you don't have to do anything with it. You've already spent the money's safe, it's there. If you have an exam seat credit in your account and you've used it to schedule an appointment with Prometric, then you need to have that appointment with Prometric. But if you've got a bank, let's say, of exam seats, which we know some candidates do, they're going to stay there for you.
Awesome, thank you. Now, my next question from an attendee is about study materials. So really, I think what this attendee is getting to is the content of the exam, which I know that we have already touched on, but just so we can have 100% clarity, will there be any changes to this content? Can we use the same study materials that we have been using? Michelle, would you like to speak to this?
So as you mentioned at the top of this webinar, there is no change to the content of the exam. So the 6 divisions are staying the same. The content areas inside each of those divisions is staying the same. So by all means, you can continue using the same test prep materials, whether NCARB materials or third-party test prep materials. All of those will continue to serve you as we make this migration from Prometric to PSI. I'll just remind everyone, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be rolling out a new, we're calling it a practice exam dashboard. As candidates migrate into PSI, they'll have access to this practice exam dashboard. And that will give you the opportunity, initially, you'll see that same practice exam, the 75-item practice exam that's on our website. You'll see that same exam kind of inside your dashboard. What's going to be different about it is that you'll actually see some information as you're going through those questions. You'll have the opportunity to find out right then and there, did I get this question right or wrong? Tell me more about this question. So that way, as you're taking this demonstration exam, you'll have the opportunity to really learn why the right answer is right, why the wrong answer is wrong as you're taking the exam, if you want to take it that way, or you can really take it as a true practice exam and wait until the end to find out how you did. Either way, you'll then be getting exam results at the end of your NCARB demonstration exam, which is kind of a nice feature that, again, we're rolling out as part of the PSI migration. In the future, you will see some additional practice exams added into that dashboard. So it'll grow into an even more robust study tool later this summer.
Thank you, Michelle. Now, Jared, a quick question about the PSI check-in process. Will there be any changes that testers can expect to that check-in?
So it is going to be slightly different when you're checking in for a PSI experience compared to a Prometric experience, right? They have slightly different standard policies, but they're actually quite similar. So let me talk about the test center experience first. When you go to a test center, yes, you're still going to have to show your valid ID, right? That is a very critical aspect of ensuring that you are you, right? And so that does not change. They still are going to be doing the metal wanding to make sure that, honestly, why they do that is because they want to make sure people aren't trying to bring hidden cameras into the testing room. That's why they do that. The reality is, other than that, PSI is going to have you, they're going to have you sign in, they're going to have you sit, they'll log you in, and they're going to sit you down at a session and get you to work. When you take an online exam, the check-in procedure, again, is a little bit different because what they do is what's nice, we believe, for you as a candidate, is it's really a self-serve that you can go through, and you're going to have to do multiple video recordings of your space before you go to a proctor. And so we know sometimes with Prometric, candidates get hung up sort of waiting between the readiness agent and the proctor. That process is quite different with PSI, which we think is going to improve your experience. So that's another benefit. And I guess another benefit on top of that, even with online proctoring, is with PSI, they have committed to having dedicated online proctors for ARE candidates, whereas right now we don't have that with Prometric, which again is another reason why sometimes our online testers end up in a queue and they have to wait a bit longer.
Thank you, Jared. One question, or really just a request that we have from an attendee, is just that you would talk more about the practice exam dashboard and what that looks like. Michelle, do you mind speaking to that?
Sure. And I will say we haven't released too much information on this yet because it's not available to everyone yet. So if it sounds like I'm just sort of hinting at it, it's because more information will be coming soon, I promise. It's really that late April, early May timeframe when candidates are able to begin migrating their eligibilities into the PSI system. At that time, you'll also see this new dashboard turn on for you inside your record. So the dashboard is available. It will be available to any candidates who have open eligibilities to test, meaning you have applied to your jurisdiction for taking the ARE, you have your eligibilities in place, you're able to start scheduling your exams. That means that you'll also then have access into this practice exam dashboard. And when you log into that, you'll see just general information on kind of how to use the dashboard, but really what it is right now you'll see just the one practice exam, the 75-item exam that we have currently. So it's just going to be pulled into the dashboard as we roll this out. And you'll have that opportunity then to take the exam in 2 different modes. So right now, if candidates take the current demonstration exam, they log into it, they go through, they answer the questions. And we've always said to candidates, just have the handbook sort of ready so that that's how you can check how well you did on the demonstration exam, right? Because all of the answers are in the handbook. Well, Jared mentioned that with the release of the new guidelines for testing with PSI, we've actually combined the guidelines and the old handbook into one document. And in doing that, we actually got rid of the questions and answers that are in the handbook for testing with Prometric. And that's because when you begin testing as a PSI candidate, all of those answers and explanations are going to be inside of the practice exam dashboard. And so that gives you that, I think, better information sort of in real time as you're taking your demonstration exam. And as I mentioned, when you then complete your demonstration exam, you'll actually get a PDF exam results. It's a little different from a score report that you would get from your ARE division, you know, in the test center or online proctored. But it's a results file that just lets you know, hey, here's how you did on your practice exam. Here's, you know, the some more explanation about, again, why the right answer is right, the wrong answer is wrong. And, you know, that reminder of additional study materials that can be found through NCARB's website. So I do just want to reiterate, because I've thrown out kind of a lot of stuff there. If you are testing with Prometric, continue to use the current guidelines and the current handbook. Keep using the current demonstration exam. If you're testing with Prometric, nothing needs to change about the way you are currently preparing for your exam. When you migrate into the PSI system to start testing with PSI, that's when you'll see some of these changes taking place. And as I said, NCARB is going to release a lot more information about that new practice exam dashboard as we get closer to making it available for candidates to use.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle. Now we are just about out of time, so I may just ask 1 or 2 more questions. One quick question for Jared. Will there be any updates to the whiteboard or calculator with PSI?
So as stated earlier, there's no changes to the exam delivery software. And so the whiteboard is going to stay the same and the calculator is going to stay the same for the time being.
Okay, thank you so much. And maybe just one last question. I guess whoever, Michelle or Jared, can answer this. Can you just clarify the important dates that test takers should remember again?
Well, I can take this one. So right now, here we are in late March. And at this moment, candidates are just sort of in information gathering mode, right? There's nothing that candidates need to do at this time other than just take it all in, right? It's a lot of information that we're sharing at this time. So just if you're testing with Prometric, continue testing. There's nothing you need to do at this time. Late April, early May, that date has not been set yet, but in late April, early May is when we will be turning on the ability for candidates to migrate into the PSI system. We will let everyone know as that date gets closer. We are going to be starting to send our ARE updates out to candidates more frequently now that we are kind of moving into this 3-month window before our full launch date. So you will have ample time to receive that messaging from NCARB. And of course, make sure that you check our website for any updates as well. So late April, early May is when candidates will be able to migrate and start scheduling their exams. A couple more important dates. May 31 is the last date that you can take an exam in the Prometric Test Center. So again, if you're that candidate that you are in the midst of testing and you really want to keep going, then keep going. Get those appointments scheduled with Prometric sooner rather than later. Prometric tends to be busier in the springtime anyway, so really get those appointments scheduled if you're wanting to keep testing with Prometric. June 14th is the day that we will be going live with testing with PSI. So when you're able to start scheduling those PSI exams, you'll see options in the scheduler starting June 14th and continuing onwards. Jared, did you have any other kind of big reminders that you wanted to throw out there?
So I think the big reminder is that we're not done communicating with you. The operational pilot, we have hundreds of candidates that have volunteered to go into PSI test centers and take live operational exams during the month of April. They're doing that for the benefit, honestly, of all of you other candidates, in that we're going to be capturing feedback from them. We're going to be doing any last minute refinements that they point out to us before we go live with all candidates in that June timeframe. So it's just important to remember that, as Michelle said, if you're testing with Prometric right now and you've got exams scheduled, just keep studying and do your thing. If you're just starting your testing process and you're on that bubble, like we talked about earlier, yes, you may want to just wait until June to then start testing with PSI. That doesn't mean you have to wait until June to schedule those. Michelle said you can migrate your eligibilities in the April, late April, early May timeframe, and then you can start scheduling for June right away. So your testing continues as you need it or want it to continue. There was a question too that I want to touch base on, which was asking the question about well, when is the ARE going to evolve, right? So we've been with ARE 5.0 now since 2016. And so historically, yeah, it seems like the ARE updates about every 10 years. 4.0 was around for about 10 years. 5.0 now has been around since 2016. NCARB is just starting conversations around what the future of the ARE is going to be. This is my chance to plug to all of you that the most important thing that is happening in the month of April is that NCARB is rolling out the analysis of practice validation survey. This is, I will say that's how critical it is. This is the critical piece of information that NCARB uses to decide what belongs in the next version of the ARE, and it will drive conversations around how to structure the ARE and the AXP and education in the future. So please participate in the analysis of practice, because it helps the organization understand what's the right threshold for licensure. After the analysis of practice, then yes, we are going to start talking about and thinking about how is the ARE going to evolve? I will tell you, it is not going to change in any dramatic ways in the next few years, because by the time we get the analysis of practice data, we do the analysis, we figure out what the future is going to be, and then build the transition plan to get there. That is still multiple years away. But please do the survey. Please do the survey, because your opinion matters.
Awesome. Thank you both. And thank you just to all of our attendees for your thoughtful questions. Thank you to our customer relations experts for answering all of those specific questions in the Q&A. And of course, to Jared and Michelle, our awesome panelists, for sharing their expertise today. Michelle, what do you feel was your biggest takeaway from today's webinar?
Oh gosh, there is a lot of information that we are providing to everyone today and will be over the next couple months. So I think the biggest takeaway is just keep reading that information carefully. I also was kind of looking through some of the open questions here. A lot of those questions are answered actually in the guidelines draft that we released last week. So again, I know it says draft on it. It's very nearly complete. We put draft on it because we know that we're going to be updating it, just kind of crossing those T's and dotting those I's over the next couple months. But by all means, that is a really super important document. Take a look through that document. There's a lot more in there than we were able to cover during this webinar. And I think that will really help a lot of candidates get a better understanding of what is going to be coming in the next few months.
Thank you, Michelle. And Jared, what about you? What was your biggest takeaway today?
So I hope your biggest takeaway, and this is actually something I said the last time we did an NCARB Live about this, is that I don't want you as a candidate to be worrying about this migration to PSI. Michelle and I and the staff at NCARB are worrying about the migration to PSI. We're making sure the systems are better. We're making sure you're going to have availability in the test centers. We're checking all the accommodations. We have been testing and retesting. And I thank you again to all of our operational pilot testers because you're part of that robust testing experience. We're doing all of this so that way you will have a better experience and some opportunities when we move over to PSI starting in June. We will continue to communicate with you throughout the next couple of months. So please read our communications, join our future NCARB live webinars, and we'll start showing you like what the practice exams are going to look like, and we'll show you what the check-in procedures are going to look like and what the screens are going to look like. We didn't want to do that today because it's just too much information too early. So again, don't worry about this. Stay focused on your testing plan, and then we'll worry about the PSI migration.
Thank you both so much. As we're wrapping up, I just want to have a few little announcements, really reaffirming what Jared just said. So again, thank you everyone. Now, as far as what's next, as our panelists mentioned, we are focusing on the operational pilot for PSI in April. But again, like we just mentioned, continue to watch your inboxes because later in April, beginning of May, we will be reaching out again with key updates and share how you can register for our next NCARB Live. So while we aren't going through right now in this webinar, exactly what the interface is going to look like, that can be something you can expect in the future. So like Jared said, if you are worried at all about this transition, don't be. Our experts are going to walk you through step by step. Just watch your inboxes and the NCARB blog for the new registration link. And of course, in the meantime, if you have questions, please reach out to our customer relations team. They are ready and happy to assist you. Yes, so lastly, don't forget, you can always watch this webinar again on our YouTube channel and stay in the loop by following us on all of our social media channels at NCARB. Thank you again to Jared and Michelle for sharing your expertise. And of course, thank you to our awesome attendees for coming today. We're so glad you were able to join us, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.